How does U.S. imperialism sustain a sense of sovereignty within each nation it's affecting? Who is most affected by these policies and actions? How does U.S. imperialism affect U.S. immigration? What is the status of the U.S. immigration system, specifically for those who are from nations most affected by U.S. imperialism? My name is Francisco Escobar, and Latin Entertainment presents Conversamos.
Yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. You should help me transform. I run the reservoir, the predator, like a hungry carnivore when I'm breaking.
We have an expert panel ready to discuss the effects of U.S. imperialism and immigration. But first, please check out our fundraising initiative, Border Angels, a nonprofit volunteer-based organization that works on reducing the number of fatalities on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Donate today. Also, this episode's business spotlight is Brown Continent, an advocacy group as a means to recognize all Southern Native tribes, families, communities, brothers and sisters, and help awaken them to their true identity and embrace it. Now let's get into our panel. We have Edna Sandoval from Unapologetic Latina, Percy Lujan, Robert Martinez, Isaac Morales, and Nicholas Ayala from Anticonquista. Almost 200 years after the enactment of the Monroe Doctrine, a U.S. policy that opposed European invasion of the Americas, Latin America, and the Caribbean has been victim to presidential puppets and fraud elections, military coups and civil wars, and various companies extracting resources, exploiting workers, and withholding political power, all for profit and the spread of so-called democracy. These actions, endorsed by the United States, have affected U.S. immigration. For our first question, what is the status of Latina immigrants in the United States?
In my neighborhood, the Jackson Heights, Elmhurst, Corona, East Elmhurst area, we have seen a disproportionate amount of cases of people getting sick with coronavirus, and as a result, many people have died. And it's one that my zip code is one of the highest with regards to deaths from coronavirus. So, with regards to, how has it affected the Latino community? Well, Corona has that effect on, it has been shown that the way the healthcare system is set up in this country, it disproportionately neglects the needs of working class people. And as a result, working class Latinos employed in service industries are disproportionately affected and are going to die at disproportionate rates. And I lost many co-workers, many union family that has sadly perished through this virus. And we are not. It's really hitting home with regards to how it has affected my community in particular.
Especially in the time of, a pandemic, what happens is now these immigrants, they're not just not going to get those stimulus checks that we, some of us got, but they're also not being able to take advantage of the healthcare system in this country, which has its own problems, but to kind of take that away from them, the financial assistance and then the health care. It's not just that we don't want immigrants in this country to not be here. It's that we want immigrants in this country to leave or die. And I think that's one of the most important things that we have to grasp on. The system isn't just trying to keep them away. It's trying to make life here in the United States hell for them, whether it's through, inciting violence against them, directly by other people, or through the systems that have been set up to not help them purposefully.
Thank you, Isaac. Robert?
Well, I work in family immigration law as well. I do a lot of asylum applications. I do a lot of consular processes, a lot of waiver petitions. Immigrants just aren't wanted in this country, period. I wish that I had better news because so many of these people came here when they were kids, or they've been here for 20 years, 25 plus, 30 years. They got family of their own, they got kids of their own, they got businesses of their own, they pay taxes. On top of that, they've been increasing the penalties for the applications. A perfect example is it used to be, and I'll keep it short, it used to be that if you were an undocumented immigrant and you were married to an American citizen, you might not be eligible for a waiver right now. But there are two parts to an adjustment application, which is the first is you have to demonstrate that there's a legitimate relationship. So that's the first part of the application that a lot of people would do. And then the second part is the actual changing of your status from having no status or having TPS or DACA or whatever into legal permanent resident. What this administration has done, and there's a perfect example of trying to scare immigrants into not being able to adjust their status, is saying, listen, if you're just, if the first part of that application is denied, it can put you into deportation proceedings. And that was never the case before. It used to be that if you haven't, if you're undocumented, what have you, you file an application, they denied it for whatever reason, or if there was something missing, what have you, they would just leave it at that and it'd be done. But now it's an all or nothing application. You have to either win it or you risk being put into deportation proceedings.
And I've seen it too. The courts just have gotten worse at being able to handle cases. The policy memorandum that USCIS is sending out to its agents when they're, processing different types of applications. There's also that, as he just very mentioned, right? They can deny something and then automatically put you into removal proceedings. Before that, like up until about a year and a half ago, that wasn't the case. And now, you're seeing a lot more. The courts were already packed, and now they're getting these NTAs, and now they're even more packed, right? But one of the things that is most pertinent in my mind right now is this public charge rule, which is kind of, saying, okay, not everybody can immigrate to this country. We already knew that. But now, if you or your family ever use some type of public benefit, there's a lot of stipulations, but essentially cash benefits are in there. Certain health policies are included in that. That kind of gets clients really worried, and then they take their children off of any health insurance that they had, even if it was Medi-Cal or something like that.
Just to add to that real quick, it's cruelty. Cruelty is the point. It's almost like it's built into the system with the way that they're making these changes in the regulations. Like Isaac was talking about, the denial rate has shot through the roof with these applications. And a lot of these petitions that they're talking about, there are certain petitions, applications like cancellation of removal, like in court, they're trying to make them even more difficult in and of itself. So it's every aspect of this is designed to, like Isaac said, it's not just to prevent immigrants from coming into the country, it's to punish them. It's to make them suffer one way or the other. And like what he was talking about with the public, the public charge rule, there's already an affidavit of support aspect of an application. If an immigrant's coming into the country and you're petitioning for them, you need to demonstrate that you earn enough money that you can take care of that immigrant. And if for whatever reason that immigrant winds up receiving some sort of public assistance, then the sponsor is technically liable for those expenses, and the government can, and they do, and they have gone after those expenses. This massive new change in the law, it's like an avalanche of new requirements that you have to demonstrate, which is really ridiculous. So you just got to be real cautious with how this is coming along with immigration, and you just got to promote people to vote, because this is just, it's getting too dangerous at this point.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, Isaac?
What Robert was mentioning about the new form that immigrants have to actually fill out, that's an 18-page form. It's not easy at all. It has given attorneys, it has given paralegals problems in figuring out exactly what to say, how to say that. If you don't have a social security number, you can't get a credit report, which means that then you're going to have an incomplete form I-944. So definitely that, I do see the classism, directly playing a role there, especially when I've worked with, I've worked with those companies that are investing the $500,000. It's people with a completely different mindset, completely different process. It's much easier for them, as much as they love to complain that it's really hard. Put your feet in these people's shoes. You're not having a difficult time having to spend $500,000 to come here to get a green card. And on top of that form I-944, there was already another form that could kind of waive that public charge. It's the Affidavit of Support. Even now, they're scrutinizing those affidavits even more. Before, it used to be literally anybody could sign for you. Now they're kind of, testing the relationships. Oh, do you actually know that person? How well do you know them? It's questions that were never asked before that are being asked now, so that the agents can find any little thing to nitpick at and then exclude these people from coming to the U.S. or adjusting their status based on their economic levels.
I think one of the reasons we're seeing more of a push to keep immigrants out of the country, and I think what's also going to be seen is more deportations, is mostly because of the economic issues, the economic crisis which is occurring in the country due to the pandemic, which ultimately ties back to U.S. imperialism. The wave of immigrants that come into this country, either undocumented or documented, is necessary for the U.S. Government. There needs to be some amount of undocumented immigrants in the country because that labor pool is necessary in order to perform jobs which most Americans won't perform. Now the problem is with the economy crashing, a lot of that labor, along with most of the regular American jobs, is being lost. So now what we're going to see is an increase in deportations, an increase in immigration controls, restrictions, anything to stop the wave of immigrants who are going to be coming to this country. And on the other hand, the other problem we're going to see, however, is that there's going to be more and more immigrants trying to get into the U.S. because the U.S. is not the only country facing an economic crisis right now. If we look at what's going on right now in Colombia, there are food strikes, there are riots going on because the country isn't doing enough for its people. So right there is a huge wave of immigration that's eventually going to make it to the United States. And those people aren't going to have enough jobs. They're going to be forced to either be deported or, live in horrible conditions here in the U.S. And that's just only in one country. So what we're going to see is a major crisis throughout Latin America, throughout all of the Americas, of unemployment, of massive deportation, massive criminalization of immigration. It's going to be, I think, intense in the next few years.
And I think the other thing that we need to pay attention is there's a lot of migration. It's happening right now that is being forced by neoliberalism, imperialism. But then when we see the way that, the system is framing is like economic migrants, when a lot of them, they're like asylum seekers. They try to pass the process of become a refugee, but they just cannot because they don't fit this narrative of how an asylum seeker looks like. Because when we see the way that the laws of how to become an asylum seeker, they were created to hold European migrants after the World War II. They are not created to hold, Latino migrants coming, escaping neoliberalism, escaping, climate, the climate refugees. They just don't, they cannot fit on the narrative on a migrant that needs to be here. They are just disposed because they don't fit.
Sometimes infuriates me, if I can say that. We have a lot of Latinos and even other immigrant populations that like to pride themselves on this idea of what the model minority is, or what, I'm not that kind of immigrant. I'm contributing to this country. I'm working and paying my taxes. When it comes to the immigration system, they don't care if you're great at whatever you do or if you're the worst person. You're lumped into this category of you're not from here, and so we don't want you here. We don't want you to come. We don't want you to bring your family here. And I say this because even when I worked with employment-based immigration, employment-based visas, that's when people have degrees from universities in the US or abroad. They've had 20 years of experience. here in the US or abroad also. And even those visas that were meant for people like them, they're getting denied more than they ever have been before. It's getting harder to even apply for them. So it doesn't matter if you're this quote unquote good immigrant or this educated immigrant or wealthy immigrant, unless you're making $500,000 or more and willing to invest $1 million into the into the economy, you're most likely gonna have a very tough time getting any type of visa. And that's just a temporary visa. That's not even a green card.
I really hate this narrative of the good migrant, the bad migrant, because fuck, we're hustling. This is hard. I don't think we cannot even use that narrative because it's really harmful. Like the way that they're using the DACA recipients as scapegoats, I think it's super harmful. So it's really difficult to really organize around a community that it's being framed over time in a way that is always punitive and is always disposable.
Thank you. And Isaac, what are your thoughts?
Everyone, whenever you start hearing that good immigrant, bad immigrant narrative, shut that crap down. Just, end it right there and then, and make them realize that, as I mentioned earlier, there might be a physical wall being erected, along the southern border, but the invisible wall is very real. This is a wall that is preventing all types of migration in every sector that was created by the INA and is now enforced by ICE, DHS, NBC, USCIS. So many agencies are actively trying to prevent people from coming to the United States. And we have to remember that these agencies are erected because they're being given power by laws and by people who are enforcing them. Sometimes it's really hard to believe that something could be a law when it's so backwards.
I got to tell you right now, in court, it's ridiculous because they're taking away the options that judges have in these cases. If you're a federal immigration court judge, it used to be that you have a certain amount of power. You can do what's known as an administrative closure of a case, or you could dismiss a case. And that would open up certain doors for certain immigrants, because there's certain petitions that if you're in a removal proceeding, you can't do it through immigration services if you're in deportation proceedings. It used to be during the last administration and the administrations before, you say, Your Honor, this client, this immigrant qualifies for XYZ petition, but we need to have this case administratively closed by the court so that the jurisdiction can go back to immigration services. Now they can't do that. If an immigrant is in deportation proceedings, it has to continue until the end. And that is insane, because all that does is add money, expense, time, trouble, and risk to the immigrants that would otherwise be able to adjust their status through a family member here. So there's a lot of little things like that has been going on right now. And it's all to the same goal, which is to discourage immigrants from coming to the country, to discourage them from adjusting their status, and to discourage them from even trying to resolve their situation. They just want you out. But obviously that's mostly my opinion, but I'm telling you right now, it's a bad time, and it's very, very discouraging. And I can only hope that, the situation changes eventually, but as it is, that's my 2 cents on it.
And I think another thing that we need to understand is, I agree with what Robert was saying about, it is really difficult right now work with community because everything is changing really fast, like overnight. There's a new thing going on. A few years ago, I remember I was able to guide some people in the community and, guide them through the process. Right now, it is impossible. And even with the question, when they come to you and ask you, like, what's the best way to, work with this person, it is really difficult to let them know what to do, because we don't know what this administration is doing with information. I think that's a big issue right now. We don't know if the information is safe. It's really difficult to organize because, community organizers are being criminalized, and it's very difficult for undocumented folks to involve in the same way that they used to be involved a few years ago.
That's true that they're using this information that immigrants have provided the system against them now, including DACA. That's why a lot of people were scared about signing up for DACA, because they said, well, why am I going to give the government my information? Because what if they use that against me? they shouldn't, and they weren't going to initially, but this is so under the power of the executive branch that whoever's the president is the person who has the main decision-making power on how that information is used and what they choose to do with it. So this just goes to show you, it's understandable why immigrants are getting nervous and scared, to even do something that looks good, like the DACA program.
So I think this is also a prevention to, learn your rights, because everything is changing. So it's really, really difficult to keep up. At the moment, there's a lot of deportations to Central America. And pretty much what this administration is doing is they're testing people in the detention center. And then if you're positive and if you're from the Northern Triangle, you're getting deported immediately. Right now, they're deporting kids without letting know their parents. The kids that are being caged, they're just getting deported if they're positive on the COVID-19. So I think that tells you a lot about this and how, caging was normalized. At some point in the US, I think the punitive incarceration, like the incarceration of folks, it's common. And then a lot of, when I started organizing, I remember it was very effective to frame around the issue of family. And now they're, the families are being caged. So I think there's just a whole narrative against the migrant. And
Thank you, Edna. And to elaborate, would you mind explaining how this has affected issues regarding the caravan in Mexico and Central America?
The caravan, because the issue of the caravan that took place, that takes place every year, but for some reason the last year was more visible. I think it's a great example to understand the conditions that are pushing people away and the way that the US decided to frame migrants in general. I think we need to pay attention and understand also that this is a very racialized issue. For example, the biggest caravan that happened before the Central American caravan last year was a caravan from Haiti. And nobody covered that because I think when we think about Latin American migration, we never think about Black migration. When we think about Black migration, we think in the Mediterranean, we think in Europe, but we need to understand that there's a lot of racialized migration. And when I say racialized, I'm talking about the Black community migrating here, but also the indigenous community from the Isthmus migrating here. Because if we take a look on the caravan, the highest number of the migrants are indigenous migrants. And indigenous migrants, they have a lot of issues passing the system of detention because a lot of them, they only speak the language of their community, Maya language, Xinca language, Garifuna language. So this, I think for me, it's really important to understand that the carceral industrial system is really, really designed to prevent those to even make it to get a case.
I mean, it is race, right? Because, like the way, like in this country, everything is racialized, right? But being immigrants, right, there is also like that component of like, I wouldn't call it racism. I would call it national oppression. Because, like, for example, Puerto Ricans being a colony of the United States, they have a different relationship to the United States as opposed to like Dominicans, So Cubans, like for a long time, as long as they step on dry land, they could become, they were on their path to become citizens. There is a difference between a Mexican coming here, and a Peruvian. Like I'm Peruvian, but like there is like overall structure of the relationship to the U.S. state is different, and that's something that just has to do with like the way the United States, the imperialist relationship of the United States towards Latin America has had for a long time.
And one of the things that I maybe would like to reframe. Yes, nationalism plays an important role if we see the relationship with, the US with different countries and the way that they are receiving their people. But we need to understand that their countries, they have their own historization. And if we see the numbers of the migrants, it's also racialized migration in each country. The people that it's being more dispossessed and oppressed economically are going to be communities of color. And if we think in Latin America specifically, we can go back to, these projects of racial democracy. We can see the Proyecto of Mestizaje in many countries like Mexico, Central America, and some of South America. So those, of course, result in a racialized migration that we can see now.
Thank you, Edna. Nicholas, what are your thoughts on classism and racism as it relates to immigration?
And so I think the racism, classism country goes hand in hand, especially when you look at countries of the global south, some of the poorest nations. If you were to expand this question onto an international level and just look at nations, the richest nations, even what Trump said in the beginning of his administration, look at the immigrants that he was talking about who are the good immigrants that he wanted. There were immigrants from Sweden, from Scandinavia, from Europe, whereas he contrasted that to, the bad immigrants, the rapists, all these evil terminologies, any evil term you can use against, the Mexicans, South Americans, Central Americans. It's a whole race issue, but it's also embedded in class, in that he's attacking the poorest nations, and that also happen to be the blackest, brown nations in the world.
But with regard to the classism issue, clearly this is classist. The public charge rule is a perfect example of it. Basically, they're using any sort of, there isn't even like a check this box and check that box, this yes, that no, and there you go, you're straight. Now they're looking at the entire circumstance of financial circumstance of the immigrants who are applying to come to the country, and they're using basically anything that they can against you. Even in the actual fact that you're just looking to immigrate into the country is a negative factor, according to the regulations that they put up. And they're talking about how you need to demonstrate, they want to know if you have medical coverage, before you even come into the country. I mean, what is that? You know what I mean? They're asking about your education and what have you. They're trying to make it so that way only the rich and the highly educated are able to come into the country on an easier basis than other immigrants, not realizing that that's part of the whole process of immigration. I mean, how many times have you heard, oh, my grandfather came here, and I'm talking from white people, from rich people. Oh, my grandfather came here with $10 in his pocket, or what have you, and then look at what he did with himself. Because the whole point of immigration is to demonstrate that you come into the country and you develop yourself, and you make a better situation for yourself and your family. I mean, even if we're talking about the president, his grandfather, I forgot which Trump it was, but his grandfather came to the country when he was 16 years old. He didn't speak English. He didn't have a job. He didn't have anything set up for himself. And he built himself up, which is the typical immigrant story. Now, I'm not saying that every immigrant that comes here is going to be, turn into this, multimillionaire or whatever, but it goes to show you that there's a certain mindset that needs to be taken into account. And they're trying to discourage anyone. In other words, they want you to come here already on third base. They don't want to give anyone the opportunity to make something for themselves. If you're going to come here as an immigrant, you need to demonstrate that you've got money, or there's someone who has a whole lot of money, or you're willing to invest a lot of money. Isaac, what's the number of when it comes to businesses? It's like $500,000 or something like that. I don't do business immigration law, but I know it's some crazy high number.
Yeah, for the EB-5 is 500,000. If you want to save a business, if you want to create a business, it's $1 million.
Look at that. What kind of immigrants? How many immigrants are going to have that kind of money, who don't already have that money? You know what I mean? And if they have that kind of money, it's already easy enough for them to come into the country. And like Francisco or I'm sorry, the other gentleman had mentioned that, I don't want to say that our country needs, I don't even like using the word illegal, undocumented. Our country needs undocumented immigrants because they do the jobs that Americans don't, because they do. And trust me, there's, try to find, some American college kid that's willing out, go out there and picking strawberries, or working in the fields in the Arizona sun, for 7 hours, 10 hours a day. You're not going to find it, or at least you're not going to find it for someone earning that kind of money. But then that brings in the other questions of how much money should they be earning in the first place.
I want to go back to what Robert said about, like Trump's grandfather was an immigrant, and why is that? Why are they denying, that access to immigrants? Like, to be honest, it's just like the time frame in which they came. Like, when I'll guess like Trump's grandfather came like at the beginning of the 1900s, where the United States was building its like um its manufacturing power. It was like just starting to become a world superpower. So it needed this very big flow of immigrants to like operate those like factories, carry out that work. Whereas as opposed to like right now, right, like the recent wave of immigration is not, it's not because the United States, like the United States stops being like an industrial power. It's not doing much industry, or not as much as it used to be. Like now it's trying to switching from that industrial powerhouse into a more service type economy, right? So it doesn't need that many people. It doesn't need like, and in this, it also needs them for something different. It doesn't need them for uh, for for to work on factories. Their factories are gone. What we need, like they need them to like run these like service jobs, which are usually lower paying and less organized.
But then, in terms of how racism and then classism plays in with the building of the U.S. empire, I think we're mentioning about Robert and Percy mentioned it when Trump's grandfather came to the U.S. The immigration system was much easier. It I won't say it was completely easy. They had to travel an entire ocean most likely, but comparatively, it was easier. But when Europeans were coming to the U.S., right? They were not all of them were being accepted, but a majority of them were being accepted. Um, we have to keep in mind that at the same time that those Europeans were coming, we were excluding Asians from coming to the United States, who were building railroads, who were building California. We were also bringing Mexicans over in this thing called the Bracero program to have them work the land for a little bit, and then we're going to send you back, and then we're going to pretend that you don't have an American birth certificate or American nationality, and we're just going to lump you in with those Mexican Americans even though you were a Californian. So that's where the racism adds on to the classism to exclude a specific type of immigrant. So I think that's just one of the things I like to focus on is, yeah, Trump's grandfather was coming in, so generally white people are going to say, well, my family did it the correct way. They came here legally. Well, at the same time that your grandfather was coming here, my grandfather, who lived in California, was sent back to Mexico even though he was born in California. And now my family has to live with that.
The country benefits from racialized labor. And yeah, I think a great example that I was thinking to give, but Isaac provide, is the racialized migration of the Chinese Exclusion Act, the labor program, the Bracero program. I think those are perfect examples to understand, okay, yeah, we want migrants here, but temporarily. And I think if we think in the future, okay, yeah, probably within all these strategies of exclusion within migrants from the global south, yeah, if in some point the US need labor, they're going to implement another program that looks like the Bracero program.
Thank you. And Robert?
This country is built off the backs of the poor and immigrants. I mean, this is what happened with the Chinese. They built the railroads. They're the ones that struggled to expand into the West. Then we've got all of these issues with trying to prevent or hold back people from immigrating into the country. But there is definitely an assault against the lower and middle class with this immigration reform. And this is something that they're gonna feel it. Just watch. When the number of immigrants coming into the country suddenly goes down by a huge amount, and then all of a sudden there's a labor shortage, and then all of a sudden these companies are now they're going to be desperate for them to bring them back in again. Just watch what happens. So this is kind of like, we're just starting this. They just opened up the floodgates right now, and it's just starting with all the headaches that are going to be caused from it. But this is definitely an assault against the lower and middle class. When it comes to immigration, they want you to already have money before you come here, and there's nothing wrong with coming here and not having a lot, because you create your life here. You build yourself up. with your efforts. And they've already demonstrated that. Look at the TPS immigrants. Look at the DACA immigrants. TPS people, the Salvadorans and the Hondurans, there's so many that have their own business. They pay their taxes. They're doing very well for themselves. Quite a few of them. And a lot of them are just happy having just, a smaller earning job or whatever, but they're not causing anybody any problems. But it's real sad. It's real sad to see this happen. Now it's just a matter of waiting and seeing, what the consequences are of it. But we're going to see it. It's going to happen soon enough.
Thank you. And Nicholas?
This country has a history of accepting first wealthy immigrants and then wealthy white immigrants who would essentially look like the same as the rest of the population, or at least the rulers of this nation. Part of the whole racism, classism, I think, question is that, in my opinion, they go hand in hand, in that the people who you see who are usually in the lower rings of the class, who are usually the poorest, tend to often be those who are, mostly those who are Black, mostly those who are indigenous, mostly those who have these racial stereotypes put out against them. And the reason I think that these racial stereotypes and this racism exists is because of the class position that many people find themselves in, right? So it's the way I see it is, to be poor, there's no race requirement to be poor. Anyone can be poor. But it just so happens that the majority of the people that are poor just happen to be, Afro-Latinos, indigenous people throughout Latin America, Africans from Africa, Asians from Southeast Asia. And it also so happens to be that those people tend to have the hardest time immigrating into the country and have to do it in the most dangerous and horrific ways, because they wouldn't be allowed to legally enter the country, so to speak.
Yes, I do agree with Nicholas with this racialization of class, and I think it's really rooted in the colonial dispossession and how the colonial dispossession evolved to neocolonialism, and then after to neoliberalism. If we can see who has the power within the extractivist economy, but in the frame of the U.S., I think I like to think about this. This country, and I'm going to use the term by Cedric Robinson, racial capitalism. So we can understand. I mean, even if when the U.S. was leading the building of the Panama Canal, they used racialized labor, Black labor, to build that, because it was a U.S. lead project. So we can see that it is embedded. I mean, racialized economy, it's something that is real. And I will add that it's also a gendered issue. For example, if you are a victim of domestic violence, you cannot apply to file a case as a refugee, as an asylum seeker. You cannot do anymore. So we need to always take in consideration, the framework of why this is racialized, why there's a class struggle embedded on this, and the issue of patriarchy in the countries that are like expulsing people, because we can see a lot of, like, crossing the desert, there's a lot of families, there's a lot of mothers with their kids escaping domestic violence, and that's a real issue. But it's not there, because when we talk about migration, we talk about, it's a family, this hetero patriarchal family migrating. But there's a lot of women escaping not only domestic violence, but feminicidios.
On top of that, if you're the victim of rape, of an assault, of anything like that, you help the police, you file the U visa. The U visa is for the crimes victims visa. It used to be, if the U visa was denied, then that was it. They just left you alone, because there's a lot of people that got, filed for U visas that they don't have a prior deportation order. They don't have any kind of criminal history of their own. They don't have any kind of, connection with immigration. Now, if you have a U visa and it's denied, that can put you into deportation proceedings. So it essentially is scaring immigrants who might otherwise be able to at least try for an adjustment or have an option for an adjustment down the line. It's trying to prevent them from doing that in the first place. It's trying to scare them. And there's a lot of little tweaks in the law and a lot of little changes that have been happening with this administration that is deliberately designed to prevent immigrants from seeking options.
Thank you, Robert. And Edna?
And if we think in the term of feminicidio, it's something that directly involves the state. and directly involves a neoliberal state that at the same time, the US is benefiting from that. So everything is connected. And if we go to the root, like for example, like I specialize in Central American migration, Central America is exposing so many migrants because we had a process of civil war led by the US. So it's always connected. I mean, I'm a scholar, so I like to historicize everything, but I think it is important to recognize the process that is behind, because it's like, okay, I'm a migrant, but I have a whole history behind. And I don't like to think like, oh, I just came here because I want a better life, blah, blah. Like, no, let's find the structural reasons why we're here, because I'm not here by myself. I'm here with a community.
Thank you. And Percy, would you like to take on that, especially with the labor movement in mind?
Like one of the things I've, I've come to realize after a while of doing activism, right? Immigrants generally don't come here to become CEOs or to become like artists. They don't come like to, make like a, they don't come with $1 million, and they don't come to become like shareholders of Amazon or anything. They come to work. They become as workers. They come to become part of working class. So, when it comes down to questions of how do we address immigration, right? It is important for us to talk about it in the question of like, what, how does immigrants fit into the labor capital dynamic in this country?
Thank you, Percy. And Nicholas?
Yeah, I agree with a lot what Percy said. It's about focusing on the working class, focusing and uniting, organizing around members of society who have been historically marginalized, if whether it's immigrants of any race, of any sex. But I think, and in addition to organizing the working class, there needs to be at the same time an international sort of solidarity movement between the working class in this country and those of other countries, whether it be immigrants or people who aren't immigrants or just in other countries, or just workers or campesinos, whatever it may be. But in teaching both organizing and activism within this country and how to fight for our rights, as well as the international imperialism and how the U.S. government is implicit in that imperialism, and how what we can do in this country to stop it here, that would build an even stronger movement than just a movement that exists in one single country. It'll be an international movement which would seriously threaten capitalism, because capitalism ultimately is an international system. You can't just defeat it in one country and expect it to go away.
Thank you, Nicholas. And going off of that, on building an international solidarity movement, the philosophy of Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X comes to mind. What would be the effects of bridging Latinos in the United States and building sovereignty and independence away from the U.S. government? Percy?
I mean, you are a sovereign country, right? So you're like, if you are going to uh, allow this, flow of capital coming to your country, right? It has to come on your terms, because at the end of the day, it's your resources they're using, right? And when they want to take more of what they give, you will be like, fuck off, right? But that's not what it happens, right? Because at the end of the day, capitalism is not just an economic policy, right? Yeah, let's do capitalism now. Today we vote not to do capitalism. That's not how it works. They're gonna have to take up loans, accept, like restructuring of their economy in order to, invite investment, just so they can have this, sort of subservient raw material extracting position into the global economic system. But as far as that's what ideally a Latin American country, will put like, sort of, and I think that's a populist notion. Like a lot of like, Latin American country parties, they will like, try to, go at, this relationship with the United States as sort of like to get to earn votes. But what ends up happening sometimes is, they still need money, they still need to participate in the system. So they give in, and that won't change unless unless a popular movements take control of the state of these Latin American states.
Thank you. Nicholas?
Well, I think if we're talking about Latin American governments, it would make sense that all governments should be responsible for trying to improve the lives of their people. The problem is in Latin America, you have a bunch of governments who could care less about the people and only care about lining their pockets. And so what we have is a set of most Latin American nations, which are extremely corrupt, which are extremely violent, heavily militarized, deal directly with paramilitaries and drug cartels, and look the other way when certain crime is committed. And so, one thing that is important when it comes to sovereignty is, like you mentioned, we're talking about U.S. intervention. A lot of these nations are not only accepting of U.S. intervention, but work alongside them. I mean, a good case is look at Colombia, and look at the. I guess one thing is I would say look at the relationships between the U.S. and Colombia and Venezuela. Recently, we saw what happened in Venezuela. The attempted coup attempt by the United States failed miserably. And they're still arresting mercenaries to this day, more and more who are connected to the operation. And that right there, Venezuela, that operation, the failure of that operation and the success of Venezuela to defend its own borders is, I guess, the best example of what sovereignty would look like in Latin America today. That, or another example would be Cuban doctors who are going international, not only in Latin America, but also in Europe to help fight the coronavirus. I mean, that's Latin American sovereignty. That's countries being autonomous and doing things that, even though the U.S. imperialists dislike, the Latin American nations continue to do them anyway, despite what others say. To see that there are some nations out there that are still committed to sovereignty, so still actually committed to helping people's lives, is good to see and shows that it is actually possible. And the fact that there are nations that are not doing that demonstrates that it's a decision by certain governments and leaders to intentionally work against the interests of the people.
Thank you. And Robert?
Honestly, I think Nicholas pretty much hit it on the head. The other thing that we got to kind of keep in mind is that the United States is in a very particular position politically and powerfully. Looking at our military, looking at how we've intervened in Latin American countries in the past, especially when it comes to countries that don't quite play ball with us. We make an effort to affect their politics, and really the big thing these days is the economic strength the United States has. I mean, we are a major consumer. We have major companies that invest serious money in their product and influencing other countries economically. You don't even have to affect, elections, which we have done in the past, but I'm talking about currently. Just the power of the dollar that the United States has and the strength in our purchasing power, that alone affects Latin American countries almost as much as anything else. So we just kind of honestly, I don't know if there's really an answer I can provide on this one, or if there's a single solution that can really solve this problem, just because it's so overwhelming. It's so multifaceted. It comes in every aspect. It's really just, a matter of, in my opinion, a matter of these leaders doing the right thing and not being, I don't want to say selfish, but I don't know what it is. When it comes to, some of these countries, once you get in charge, it just kind of does something to your head. And, now you start looking at things from a certain political point of view and looking out for your boys and your friends and all that kinds of stuff. And it happens with us just as much as it happens with anybody else. But we're in a position where we could roll with the punches a little bit, and we could take a bigger hit than other countries can take. And it doesn't affect their citizenry quite as much. So I don't know. It's a bit of a tricky, sticky wicket that we're dealing with here.
Thank you. And Edna?
I think it is important to recognize that Latin America do not only fit within the definition of nation state, because there's a lot of independent territories in Abya Yala Like there's a lot of pueblos originarios that do not recognize the nation state as, you know, a place, a composition they're living. They recognize their own sovereign territories. So I think that's one of the first things that we need to recognize when we talk about Latin America, because I think we often think about, you know, nation state, the identity. We think about Latin America and we expect that, you know, this state represent some values, but at the same time, going back what everybody been expressing, every time that a country try to get some power, they're immediately possessed by military oppression. And we need to understand that it's also embedded with capitalism, because imperialism is the maximum expression of capitalism. So I think it's all related. It's all related. And I think it is important to have a diasporic trans-territorial connection. It is important because unfortunately there's a lot of heavy military repression in Latin America that is not expressed on the same way here.
Thank you, and Isaac.
Right. So I'm going to go off of that, right, about these territories, these towns, if you want to call them, that don't recognize the nation state. And it brings to mind, to me, this idea that maybe as a Chicano I have of el pueblo unido, and what can that mean? And for me, I've always struggled with it because I'm like, how can I help my Latin American compatriotas if there's not even, if I can't even see a sense of unity within the Latino community that I am a part of, right? There's the individual outspoken, you know, few of us that, you know, we're very proud of whatever Latin American background we come from, but, you know, because of different, you know, maybe they're afraid because of their immigration status, maybe, as you mentioned, Francisco, their family has been here for 6 generations, so they have no tie to their heritage in a different country, because their heritage to them, as far as they're concerned, is here in the United States. And
so I think it is important to have a space here in order to make a space, to make a voice, you know, even with economic support. I think it is key to help the territories that are being, you know, like people that is organizing they're being murdered. It is like that. People is organizing because they want right to clean water, and they're being murdered. Every time that there's an attempt to gain some kind of, you know, advance on what they know of as democracy, they're repressed. So I think it is important to have a space here. Just because of the criminalization is different. I'm not saying an excuse that there's not in the US, because we deal with police brutality, we deal with the criminalization of activism too, but just look different. And then there's a different strategy. So I think it is important to use both strategies. Just thinking about the fact that a lot of people cannot migrate here, and a lot of people cannot go back to their homelands. A lot of people have a life here because they're part of a diaspora. So I think that's super important. But for me, it's also important to recognize that some of us, we don't fit with this idea of Latin America just because we come from a place of dispossession, of war, of violence. But it is important to organize within the communities, within communities that are aligned with our vision. Just because what I say, everybody holds a different kind of privilege, and we can use that to move forward.
And I guess part of the first step in towards creating this type of coalition, this international coalition, is to further strengthen the sense of unity that we have here, especially in times of fear. It seems like, you know, we're all out. It's a lot of selfishness going around. As much as there is selflessness, I have seen a lot more selfishness just in my own community. So kind of building that pueblo up, and then reaching out and remembering that maybe you don't have family in another Latin American country because everyone had to flee to the United States, or whatever your situation is, there's still someone that you owe your success to in the United States because of the exploitation of that the U.S. empire has caused in someone else's native country. So to even, we might be ravaged out here in the U.S., but there is a sense that, of responsibility, of understanding whatever opportunity there is here, it has to be, you have to remember that opportunity is because you took it away from someone, or maybe not you directly, but the state, the state apparatuses took them away. So unearth those, as Louis Althusser used to say, the ideological state apparati. Figure out how education, how religion, how community centers, how all these things are making you complacent in the United States, how they're making you sometimes feel like you're the victim without agency. But no, we do always have that agency. We have to remember we're a strong people. We just need to recognize that, as corny as it is, el pueblo unido no será vencido, right? So that's kind of where my optimism is from, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And Nicholas?
I would say the most important issue is international solidarity, trying to build an international network between people here in the diaspora and between people from the homeland. And it's like Edna said, here we have a lot more, it's a lot more, I would say, safe in the United States compared to the very violent and explicit repression that occurs in the South. But that's easier. Like I said, the whole idea of international solidarity, raising awareness, is easier said than done. One thing I think of is I think of New Yorkers who, born in the Bronx, who, their parents born in the Bronx, grandparents born in the Bronx, they never been to the island, they have no connection to the island. How do you get someone to connect to issues outside of this country when, they're when they've been disconnected through generations? So, and that's one of the problems I think that we're going to face. But I think there is optimism. It wasn't that long ago we saw the huge protests in Puerto Rico in the island. Not only did we see the huge movement in social unrest in the island, but that also spread to many Puerto Ricans who are here in the nation, right? Those who don't live on the island. I noticed a lot of people who never were interested in politics, especially in Puerto Rico, suddenly started caring about what was going on and the corruption in Puerto Rico and how mistreated they were. So I think as things start getting more serious and as issues start compiling on each other, I think it'll be easier to start building those international connections. People will start to see, oh, well, my family over here or the people who look like me in this country are being mistreated because of, this and this and this. And I think I can relate to that because as things get worse in this country, I feel mistreated, right? I think building those solidarity and building that bridge will get easier as things continue, but it's a tough path, but it's what needs to be done.
I mean, look, people can talk about revolution and this and that and all that stuff, but really, to be honest, we're in a system, and this is a very powerful legal system that we have, and you can make changes in it. It's just you got to get enough people to want to make changes. The thing I would push against is this whole idea of both sides are bad. There's no point in voting. And this and this and that and that, when people don't vote or they don't care about voting or they don't get involved politically, you're essentially telling other people, I'm going to let you make all the decisions for me. And that's the reason we've got as bad as we have when it comes to this immigration thing, because if enough people push back and vote and really work the system, and I mean work the system in the sense of, in an overwhelming sense, that's when you can start getting politicians to pay attention to you. Because if you don't vote, they don't care about you. You're a non-factor because you have no influence over them. But if you make it clear that you're coming from a group that has the ability to support someone or push back against someone, that's when they start to take you seriously. And then that's when they'll start to listen to what you have to say.
With that being said, that is all the time that we have for today. Thank you all for sharing and creating such a great conversation. For everyone at home, make sure you like our video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Instagram, and tune in next week as we discuss about collegiate Latina Greek life after graduation. Until next time in Conversamos.
Yo, is it that wrong? I'm making a song, I'm taking it back for the platform that I formed. You should chop it and transform. I run the reservoir, the predator, like a hungry carnivore. When I'm breaking through these heavy doors, this is Desert Storm. A metaphor to show I'm equipped and informed. I'm striking with the mega force, I'm lukewarm, your crew swarms. With the fear, my lyrics do harm. If you ain't lending a hand, I'm breaking your two arms, so listen. I'm sniffing the difference on my mission, I'm craving. I envision these premonitions like Raven, I'm gifted. I saved it, now it's time to shift to my haven. My advanced pace, it remains in a basin where I'm chasing pavements. Straight erasing with this